Hey folks, I just want to follow off with our muscle discussions on something that I'm probably not going to expect you to remember a whole lot, but I think it's sort of an interesting thing to mention and just to talk a couple minutes about. And now that we know, and hopefully you've looked at the videos and you understand at least a good idea in regards to how muscle works, in regards to its signal from the brain all the way down to the myoneural junction, across the synaptic cleft, and blah, 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 all that stuff. But all the way along that range, all the way from the brain on down, things could happen that will cause muscle to malfunction in one way or the other. And I just want to spend just a couple minutes in talking about a couple of those things may happen, just for your own personal information that might help you understand things a little bit better. Okay, I left a little picture of me in the corner so that way you can see I'm still alive. Okay, but I'm still here, so it's not somebody else giving this. So let's talk about some of the problems that may occur. We think about where this could occur. The problem with muscle function could occur anywhere along this whole tract, all the way from the motor cortex, which we talked about as being a special little band of neural tissue in the brain, all the way down the spinal cord. There could be spinal cord related problems. Once the nerve leaves the spinal cord, it becomes part of the peripheral nervous system, and that's involving the peripheral motor nerve. Then we could also have problems at the neuromuscular junction, right where that point where that axon terminal, the nerve terminal meets the synaptic gutter at the synaptic cleft for the acetylcholine. So that could be a problem there, which I have personal experience with a little bit. And we could also have problems with the muscle fiber itself. So let's talk just very briefly about each of these if you're really interested in looking at these things. We talked about that before. Let's talk about first a problem at the motor cortex, okay? And the problem that we have with the motor cortex is, again, that's where this whole signal that starts the ball rolling begins. It starts in the motor cortex region. And if I have a portion of the motor cortex that becomes diseased, inactivated, damaged, destroyed, involved with something else, such as by a tumor, or a cerebral vascular accident, which we also would in lay terms know as a stroke, where the blood supply for some reason gets interrupted either by a hemorrhage or by a blockage of an artery to a part of the brain, particularly to the motor cortex area, which would be individuals, so we're talking about now, or sometimes even with things like toxins. Lead, arsenic, and things like that will affect the motor cortex, or affects the whole brain, and therefore affects the motor cortex. Also, various drugs, which are central nervous system depressants or stimulants, may actually affect how that motor cortex works, and therefore we might have some problems. And another thing we have to think about is something called cerebral edema. We've talked about this a little bit before. We mentioned it briefly in lab. We talked about what happens in people with head injuries, what will happen, or some type of trauma, either trauma to the head or encephalitis or whatever the case may be. The inflammation causes the brain to swell. When the brain starts to swell, it has nowhere to go. I mean, we're talking about a closed coconut with the brain sitting inside. Where's the brain going to go? Well, obviously it's going to go out the path of least resistance. What's the path of least resistance? Off that foramen magnum. So as a result, when the brain starts to swell, the cortex gets squished against the sides of the cranium on the inside, and that becomes a problem. So if I have a problem by any of these reasons, by tumor, by stroke, by toxins, by drugs, or by swelling of the brain, all of a sudden that signal that starts in the area of the motor cortex is stopped. And because it's stopped, guess what? Nothing happens at the muscle. So that's where the first level of problem might be in the motor cortex itself, and that would be a problem that, again, if I can't start the signal, it can't go anywhere. You know, if the car's out of gas, you can't drive anywhere. So as a result, that's what happens here in the motor cortex. The second place that we might have a problem might be in the spinal cord, and this is where we have a spinal cord injury with like a vertebral fracture or something like that. In a more unusual situation would be tumor or something like that. And I'll mention drugs and anesthetics in just a second. But in the case of a spinal cord injury, obviously what happens is if I injure the spinal cord, everything below that level becomes involved. In other words, if I stop that transmission of that nerve down the spinal cord, if I have something that actually either separates the spinal cord or stretches it, where these axons, as they pass a certain segment on the spinal cord, have to go through, all of a sudden everything below that, nothing happens. Things above it will happen. Obviously, therefore, if I have a cervical fracture, the higher the cervical fracture, the more significant it is. Once we get up to around the level of C3, which we all know about, and above, the diaphragm which is very essential in regards to respiration, comes from nerve roots from C3, C4, and C5. And as a result, what happens is because they're not getting any signal. The signal may start in the brain, but we're not getting, or somewhere in the brain, but we're not getting the signal past where that C3 fracture would be that involves the spinal cord. Then all of a sudden, the diaphragm doesn't work. If diaphragm doesn't work, then guess what? We can't really breathe very well. So that's the problem with a cord injury, vertebral fracture, a dislocation. We talked a little bit about how that odontoid process, the dens, they have a special X-ray view that will actually look through the mouth to be able to see what that odontoid process, if it might be fractured. And we talked about how that odontoid process is involved in that rotational aspect of the head to be able to go side to side. Again, tumors not all that as much more as common as spinal cord injury. We should mention something about drugs or anesthetics, and we see this particularly with like an epidural type of anesthesia, where what they do is the dura is a membrane that surrounds the spinal cord as well as the brain. We'll talk about that in our next section, in the neurology section. What happens is by taking the local anesthetic and putting it around the spinal cord, it sort of causes a change in the nerve whereby that nerve no longer is able to conduct an impulse. I shouldn't probably take the time to go into how a local anesthetic works. What the local anesthetic works is they stabilize the membrane so they can't have this exchange of that sodium and potassium, and we know that that's important in regards to creating that action potential. So as a result, if I do use some type of an anesthetic drug that stops the ability of the exchange of the sodium and potassium, the sodium rushing in and potassium rushing out, basically nothing beyond that works, and that's how I get the local anesthesia. So if they take a local anesthesia and put it around the spinal cord, obviously it causes that change. It stabilizes the cell membrane, and therefore it can't transmit a nerve signal. So therefore we might have a problem that occurs at the spinal cord level. So that'd be our second level. So we talked about the motor cortex as well as the spinal cord level being a problem. The third thing would be in the area of the peripheral motor nerve, okay? And this would be where we sometimes have an injury, okay, where sometimes if you've ever use crutches. One of the ways that people abnormally use crutches is they take the crutch pads and they jam them up in the armpit region. And as a result, in the armpit region, or the axillary, I should say axillary, if I want to be perfectly correct, because you all know that word. If they jam it up in the axillary region, it presses against a group of nerves that comes in a plexus called the brachial plexus. And sometimes there's weakness in the hands as well as in the area of the in the arms and the fingers. It depends upon what nerves involved. Also, when people have a herniated disc, one of the things that they sometimes notice is they have a problem, a weakness in muscles that go beyond that. Why? We talked about this a little bit in lab. When the disc protrudes out from where that is between the bodies of the vertebrae, it presses against the peripheral nerve as it's coming out of that spinal canal and going out through that little hole in that foramen on the side of between each successive vertebrae, and then that results in the problem where it blocks that nerve impulse. Also, local anesthetics. I know that a lot of times if I had like a digit and I wanted to block the whole digit, instead of just sticking a needle in the area that I want to block, I just numb the whole digit. And basically I did that just by taking one of the peripheral nerves and knowing where the peripheral nerves are, just taking a little bit of local anesthetic and putting, and sometimes it only takes a couple drops, a very small amount where the nerves are, and it blocks the whole digit. With about maybe 4 cc's of a local anesthetic, I could probably block a whole foot, okay? Simply by just knowing where those nerves are and putting some local anesthetic around that area, and it really numbs almost the whole area. So basically using local anesthetics will and instilling them around that nerve will provide local anesthesia, again for the same reason we talked about with the area in regards to the local anesthesia around the spinal cord, by changing and stabilizing the membrane so I don't have that transfer back and forth between sodium rushing in, potassium rushing out, that actually what stimulates that action potential from occurring. So if I block that action potential, I can't send that signal down the nerve, okay? And so that's what the local anesthetics will do on a peripheral nerve. We also have a problem with the neuromuscular junction, okay? And what happens is if there's some, again, the thing that triggers the action potential along the sarcolemma is the acetylcholine, and you should know that by now. If you don't know that by now, guess what? You're way behind the learning curve, okay? The acetylcholine is what does that. When the acetylcholine is released from the nerve terminal, then what happens, it goes across that synaptic cleft, and as a result, what we'll find is that synaptic cleft has receptors that have to get the acetylcholine. There is a condition called myasthenia gravis, which is an autoimmune condition that actually does a couple things. Number one, it autoimmune-wise, the body creates an immune response against this neuromuscular junction, and basically what it does, the cleft gets changed, the size of the cleft gets changed, there's fewer folds that are in there. There are antibodies that are actually directed against the acetylcholine receptor sites, and if I destroy the receptor sites, even if I release the acetylcholine into the synaptic cleft, there's nothing to bind to, and therefore it reduces muscle strength and stuff like that. There also might be certain antibodies that will work against the production or work against acetylcholine to destroy it. And so what happens is they try to use drugs that will actually use whatever acetylcholine's there, even if there's decreased number of receptors, and they try to maximize that amount of acetylcholine. And they do that by taking drugs that actually decrease the effectiveness of cholinesterase, which would break down the acetylcholine. So it allows the acetylcholine to stay in that synaptic cleft longer, and if there's little less of it, it still has a greater chance of binding to some receptor sites, even the receptor sites are less. This is a condition that I know up close and personal, because a number of years ago, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis. Went through all kinds of antibody testing at that time. They looked at all kinds of antibodies, and sure enough, there are antibodies that were there against some of these aspects in regards to the acetylcholine and the receptors, mostly the receptors. So basically, I take a medication, anywhere from 2 to 3 times a day, depends upon how things are going, to try to help to control this a little bit. It allows the cholinesterase not to work, and as a result, it maximizes my amount of acetylcholine, which is either decreased or the receptors being decreased. So therefore, I get that muscle contraction. I hate the medication from a personal note, because it does a lot of really bad things. It really crazies up my GI tract a lot. Okay, once I take this medication, my gosh, my GI tract goes crazy. As well as, if you ever notice my pupils are very, very small, and that's one of the side effects that we find from the drug, which is pyridostigmine, okay, or mestinon. You could look it up in a PDR, or whatever the case may be. And what happens is it also salivation. It causes a lot of salivation, which is a huge problem that I have to deal with all the time. So please don't look really close when you look at the drips on my shirts or anything like that in class. But anyway, going beyond a personal note, it sort of helps to control that by having something that blocks or destroys the cholinesterase to maximize the amount of acetylcholine. So this is now we have a problem not just at the motor cortex, not the spinal cord, not the peripheral nerve, but where that neuromuscular junction is, and that's what we see with this condition called myasthenia gravis. The bad part about the myasthenia gravis is repetitive actions causes people to get progressively more and more weak as time goes on. With repeated actions, not like tomorrow you're going to be weaker than today, which is going to be weaker the day after that, not like that. But if you take and you repeatedly move a muscle, that will also cause the muscle to repetitively get weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. Because again, it's a problem also with that amount of acetylcholine that we have in the receptors. Okay, that's another problem. And then one of the problems that you always have to worry about is, does it eventually evolve the diaphragm? It involves the diaphragm, the difficulty of being able to breathe. I know with me, over the past 5-6 years since I was diagnosed, the biggest problem seems to be sometimes difficulty swallowing. So sometimes I'll get a big chunk. If I remember once in Taco Bell, sitting there, I think we were going to a game, so my wife and I stopped at Taco Bell just to get something really quick before we went to a game, and took a big chunk of a taco, and I couldn't swallow. So I'm sitting there choking and spitting around and stuff like that, and finally had to scoop things out of my mouth, and my wife is getting a little nervous about it and stuff like that. I'm just hoping a lot of other people don't see me, and I'm sure the people behind the counter at Taco Bell weren't very pleased. But anyway, that's a little bit about myasthenia gravis. Okay, so that's that. Also, when we talk about that neuromuscular junction, that mild neural junction, there are other things that happens. Hypocalcemia or excessive magnesium might cause a problem. And what happens is, if I have low calcium, if we remember back to our last lecture, and even when we talked about it a little bit before, the importance in regards to how that muscle contracts, the importance of calcium. Okay, so as a result, what happens if the calcium is low, the calcium, when the nerve impulse gets down to the axon, the nerve ending, along the axon terminal, and it gets down to that, it causes that release of the calcium, and that release of the calcium in the end of the nerve will allow the acetylcholine to be released. Well, what happens if you don't have enough, if your body levels of calcium are low, you don't release the acetylcholine, and therefore you can't have that same contraction. So the problem's at the neuromuscular junction at that point. Also, certain drugs such as curare. They talked about poison darts and stuff like that, and curare was used, or modifications of it, in regards to creating paralysis for surgery. So when people have surgery, they do some type of a paralysis, and this paralysis will prevent the muscles from contracting during surgery, which allows the surgeon to work a little bit better when people are underneath anesthesia. So what happens, but when we talk about curare or curariform type drugs, what happens is once they get into the system, they get into that synaptic cleft, and they compete with the acetylcholine for receptor sites. So they bind the receptor sites, so therefore the acetylcholine's all dressed up but no place to go, no receptor sites to bind for. And if there's no receptor sites to bind for, because all of them are bound with curare or curare-like drugs, then guess what? The acetylcholine doesn't cause the stimulation of the sarcolemma, and therefore there's no muscle contraction. And that's what would happen with that. And so certain drugs will also cause a restriction of activity at the neuromuscular junction. Another thing is a reduced cholinesterase. Okay, certain things like certain nerve gases that were used, as well as certain other drugs, reduce the cholinesterase. I know that I take a pyridostigmine, okay, but physostigmine is very similar. And what happens is in a normal person, well, if I just leave that acetylcholine around too long, that what happens is now the acetylcholine remains attached to the area of the receptors, and the muscle stays in a sustained contraction. So these are things we have to worry about. So this is just the opposite. Instead of decreasing activity, it enhances it, which is also a problem that we'd find at the neuromuscular junction. The nerve fiber itself, certain injuries may cause a problem. Also various drugs, carbachol and stuff like that. And what they do is they depolarize the muscle fiber, and the end plate potential is changed. Okay, but what happens is negative potential at the muscle is never generated, so it actually causes a block. Okay, and that's just another thing which is